When it comes to video games, sometimes a reboot can be necessary to revitalize a gaming series, and sometimes they can be done very well. There's some great examples like Tomb Raider and Hitman. Other times, some games get a half reboot where maybe bits and pieces of the established universe and the storyline are still canon, but the series is clearly moving in a new direction. For example, games like God of War or Wolfenstein: The New Order. But sometimes game studios want to just clear the state, do something completely brand new with no strings attached, and oh boy, is it just the worst. We're looking at games that were strict reboots of existing franchises that made the franchise worse off afterwards, like 2010's Medal of Honor. Okay, let's actually back up to 1998 for a second. One of the biggest and greatest World War II films of all time, Saving Private Ryan, directed by Steven Spielberg, released and was a huge success. Steven Spielberg has been known for having a deep interest in World War II history, and after seeing his son playing GoldenEye one day, he thought that a World War II video game could be a really interesting concept. Long story short, Steven Spielberg teamed up with DreamWorks Interactive and EA to pitch and write an idea for a video game World War II experience, which would become 1999's Medal of Honor for the PlayStation and later would release on other consoles as well. This video game series was now groundbreaking, a huge success. It won a ton of awards and turned into a series of games that would release pretty regularly. A few years later, Medal of Honor Allied Assault would release the third game in the series, and a portion of the team that worked on that game would leave and start a new studio under Activision, which would go on to create the Call of Duty series. Medal of Honor had some big competition, but when Call of Duty ended up becoming explosively popular when Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare released in 2007, and World War II fatigue was starting to become a thing in the video game space, EA decided to put a ton of money into fully rebooting the Medal of Honor series, but this time in a modern setting. EA set up a new team to work on this project, gave it one of the biggest budgets at the time, and did a huge marketing campaign for this game, even featuring Linkin Park in the E3 trailer back in 2010, and the game released to a meh performance. It was passable, sure, but Medal of Honor had some punching weight to it, and with a game series that had titles that were sometimes touted as the best of the best, this game didn't live up to the prestige that the older Medal of Honor games had. If anything, it felt like just another campaign with maybe too many resemblances to a game like Call of Duty or EA's own Battlefield. This game was a commercial success, sure, but I think a lot of the fans that bought into this game expected the game to be maybe more bombastic of an experience than what they ended up actually getting. When 2 years later a sequel would release, the game was received much worse and was a commercial disappointment. Up until the Medal of Honor reboot, there were games being released on a pretty regular basis, but after the second game in the reboot series, Medal of Honor would not see a new release ever again. At least for now. At the time of recording this, it's been 11 years and there hasn't been any Medal of Honor news. It's really interesting to see how games in the mid to late 2000s were a lot of the times subject to random reboots that were unexpected, like Bomberman, for example. Now, Bomberman initially started all the way back in 1983, but by the follow-up reboot of the game in 1990, the character would see a redesign that looks more similarly to the Bomberman that we all know and love, and especially by 1992, the character had a pretty established appearance that would exist for the entirety of the franchise. So after like 15 years of the character more or less looking like this, when Bomberman Act Zero was announced and the character that went from this looked like this now, and the game would be taking the narrative into a realistic dystopian dark future setting, fans were pretty perplexed to say the least. Tie that together with the fact that the game wasn't well received because the gameplay itself wasn't good and there was long loading times, repetitive textures and graphics, and a tedious and repetitive gameplay, this game was bombed review-wise. No pun intended, getting 3 out of 10s and 2 out of 10s across the board. This was apparently supposed to be the start of a new series in the Bomberman genre, I guess. But after this came out, this idea and look for the character was immediately shelved, and Hudson Soft would never try to make a Bomberman character look like this ever again. That didn't stop them from doing some other weird things with the design of the character, but nothing nearly as bad as Act Zero. Okay, I'll be honest, I'm still really mad that Battletoads released without online cooperative play. It's to the point where I refuse to even play the game. I know it sounds very petty, it kind of is, but I personally felt so slighted by a game that was known for having some of of the best cooperative play back in the day, having a developer that seems so disconnected from what made the original game so exciting that they only included local cooperative play and not online cooperative play in a day and age where most people play games online cooperatively. Sure, there are things out there if I got it on PC where I could play like Parsec or something. I know it's a weird hill to die on, but that's the hill I'm choosing to die on here. But what about the reboot for Sim City? This game was one of the most disastrous game launches ever. Now, the first SimCity game actually came out all the way back in 1989. It was really popular. It released 4 main games. It had a bunch of spin-offs, console ports, and more throughout the years. But after SimCity 4 in 2003, there was just no SimCity game for an entire decade. And then the 2013 reboot to the franchise came called just SimCity. Now, when it comes to the visuals and graphics, sure, the game was praised, but when it came to the gameplay, you know, the actual cities you could build felt way smaller than any SimCity game before, which affected the entire game in a very negative way. And it was just a downgrade essentially from some of the features and potential of things you could do from games in the series that were 10 years older. But there were more issues, like the game was always online, where your save file was saved to a server and not locally, plus the servers didn't work for a long time at launch, so you could lose your save file easily and all of your progress. It was just really unfinished and never really got fixed either, which killed the franchise. And to this day, if I remember correctly, even some review sites couldn't review the game because journalists couldn't even connect to play the game. The game had no right releasing in the state that it did. But then on the other hand, another popular game from the late 90s, early 2000s that was especially popular on PC was the Zoo Tycoon series. Oh boy, was this like an iconic game to have in the 90s on your computer, and there was a lot of fun to have just kind of having your zoo, and you got to manage your animals and make sure everything's good with them, and you have this like whole business side of things. You got to make sure your ticket admissions are right and you have the right staff. This game then would come out as a launch title in a new rebooted form as Zoo Tycoon for the Xbox One, and I remember getting this with my Xbox One day one, and I was like the most disappointed gamer in 2013. I bought an Xbox One launch day instead of a PS4 so I could play Zoo Tycoon. What was I thinking? This Zoo Tycoon did not nearly live up to the large amount of control you had over your zoo in the original games, and it felt very much more like a animal simulator that you could watch and sometimes interact with and choose some parts of, but so much of the game was kind of cut off and you didn't have that whole business side of it, which also was really fun even as a kid, where you actually felt like you were running a zoo. This time it just feels like you're at a zoo and you get to pick kind of like what animals you have sometimes. You don't get to like customize things freely as much as I'd like to. They did do some more iterations with this version of Zoo Tycoon, and apparently the newer versions are a bit better. I did go back a couple years ago and play the new version since it is co-op and on Game Pass, and it was a better experience. There was more flexibility in what you could do and creativity, but that original version, just Zoo Tycoon for the Xbox One, still angry about it. Speaking of launch titles, let's look at the Wii U, specifically Zombie U. Most people actually don't know that this game is a reboot of a franchise that would be a launch title for the Wii U. It was supposed to be one of the grittier and darker, more adult-themed Wii U games to show adults, hey, you could buy this console too. But yeah, Zombie U actually is a reboot of the long-forgotten series, which was a first-person game called Zombie, released in 1986 and was published by Ubisoft back when they still had a space in their name. It released on the Commodore 64, DOS, Atari, ST, and Amiga systems, amongst other systems as well, and was a simple exploration point-and-click zombie game that was in the first person. Honestly, the sound that the zombies made when they died was like top-tier sound design by 1986 standards. So after this franchise being pretty much dormant and long forgotten, Ubisoft decided to slap this title back on this brand new franchise coming to the Wii U, and thus Zombie U was born. Now when it comes to this game, it seems like most people who played this game fall into two camps. They either like the idea of a slow-moving melee-focused combat game where every zombie is a deadly threat, or they hated the idea of a slow-moving melee-focused combat game where every zombie is a deadly threat. Personally, the way I look at it is there were some unique ideas behind the game, and the slower approach was very different in a time where zombies were very popular, mind you, but to me it always felt like a prototype for what could have made a really fun zombie game that never got outside of the prototype staging. This game was a pretty big flop for Ubisoft, and they would later release it as just Zombie, without the U, on Xbox One and PlayStation 4, and they never did anything with this series again. Star Fox is another interesting game. This released originally on the Super Nintendo back in the 90s, and while a sequel was pretty much finished, they decided to scrap that in favor of doing a reboot for the Nintendo 64 with Star Fox 64, which completely retold the lore and universe of Star Fox, but this time with those 64-bit graphics. This franchise would then be continued on through Star Fox Adventure, Star Fox Assault, and Star Fox Command, and then from there, Star Fox would become dormant, and there would just be nothing Star Fox related for a while. In an attempt to revitalize the series and maybe set things up for the future, Star Fox 64 3D came out for the 3DS, which was a remake of Star Fox 64, which was great, a good retelling. They got the old voice cast mostly back together. People thought maybe they were setting things up to do kind of like a fresh boot from there, but then in 2016, Star Fox Zero released, which would be another reboot to Star Fox again, a retelling of the same story that was done in the original Star Fox 64, and Star Fox 64 3D, but this time it was on the Wii U. That was the main difference story-wise. The gameplay was different, and it incorporated different ideas and some inspiration from that canceled Star Fox 2 game, and the two-screen system was really weird. It definitely hindered the gameplay more than it was a unique experience for a Wii U title, but Star Fox Zero was pretty much criticized for being too much like the original Star Fox games without being as good as the original Star Fox games. And this game would just be forgotten. Nintendo wouldn't even bother porting it to the Switch, and other than a weird appearance in Starlink Battle for Atlas, the Star Fox franchise has been dead ever since. Next, let's talk about Saints Row 2022. Where do we even begin with this? The original Saints Row franchise started in the mid-2000s. It actually was a really clever play by Volition back in the day. Make an open-world gaming experience much like Grand Theft Auto, which at the time San Andreas was the newest GTA game, and put it on the Xbox 360 before Rockstar releases the next Grand Theft Auto game. Saints Row was born out of this, but then evolved to become its own franchise that could stand on its own 2 feet. Sure, heavily inspired by Grand Theft Auto, Saints Row had a lot of concepts and ideas, but chose to turn the realism down just a little bit and maybe turn the dial up on the satirical side of the game. And boom, a franchise that almost exists as a parody directly to Grand Theft Auto was born, and it was great. The story still had its serious beats, but was filled with comedy and a lot of situational humor, and as the franchise would continue on with Saints Row 2, more features and customization would be added to the game, and the narrative stakes were constantly on a rise. Saints Row 3 got a much bigger budget and saw a new city and a lot of new features added to the game, and just generally looked really good for the early 2010s. And with Saints Row 3, of course, the narrative stakes and the bar was constantly rising well beyond anything you would experience in Grand Theft Auto. Like, I don't know, how often are you free-falling in a tank and fighting zombies off at the same time in a GTA game? Don't get me wrong, the Grand Theft Auto games set the bar for this kind of stuff, but Saints Row built their own path on how they could diverge from what people expect from a traditional game like this. And then Saints Row 4 went like all in with aliens, outer space, and superpowers. So it was very clear when it came time for Saints Row to finally be revisited and brought back to life that Saints Row would probably need to do a full-on reboot, because how do you come back from destroying the earth like what happened in Saints Row 4? And then we got Saints Row 2022. I guess that's what we can call it because it's a reboot of Saints Row. And the reception on this was not good. I don't know, maybe this game would have done well if this exact story was put in a game in 2006, but for a 2022 release, there's just so much that makes this game come across more as cringy than comedic or clever. From a narrative perspective, none of the characters seem realistic, and neither do any of their actions or journeys that their characters go on. The story is relatively predictable and doesn't introduce anything new or creative in the form of characters to make the Saints Row game stand apart, and doesn't have enough likable characters or characters that are better than the original characters that were scrapped in favor of this crew to make you necessarily feel invested in what's going on a lot of the times with the story. From the story perspective alone, it feels like the game is trying to tell you that it's a good game rather than letting it show you that it's a good game. It just lacks a lot of the creativity and uniqueness that the previous Saints Row games had. Also, the game was a buggy mess. There were a ton of glitches, and the game was just very much so so not polished and not ready to be released, that probably didn't help its case all that much either. And then while you're actually playing through the main story and, you're just trying to make your way through things, a lot of the gameplay is incredibly repetitive. They didn't go out of their way to make sure that the gameplay felt varied across experiences. It's just a lot of go here, shoot these enemies, then go here. There's nothing breaking up the monotony, and without a good cast or a good story, dealing with a lot of this feels much more like a slog than what other games that still have some features like this do have. But I'll be honest, a lot of the writing is just really, really cringe. It feels way too slapstick. It feels like the franchise hasn't matured to modern day comedic sentiment and is maybe just trying to rely on like a slapstick type joke that maybe would have been funny when the player base was 12 maybe, but a lot of the people who are coming back to Saints Row years later grew up with the Saints Row series, and there's a reason why those players will go back and play the old Saints Row games and still recognize the appeal to those, but not want anything to do with the new one. But what about games like Devil May Cry? This one is more about characters and writing than it is actually about the gameplay or anything. DMC Devil May Cry was supposed to be a reboot to the Devil May Cry games after there were 4 previous main games, so this whole thing was set in a parallel universe. Now the main character, Dante, was the most identifying character of the whole franchise with his bleach blonde hair, and was always written in a way where he was the hopeful hero up until this point. Now in 2013, whoever decided to reboot the franchise thought it was a good idea to basically turn Dante into a snarky emo character and change his design and behavior almost completely. Fans didn't resonate with this as much, and they actually kind of ignored this reboot, and the next major game, Devil May Cry 5, would just be a sequel to Devil May Cry 4. This next one's a little bit more controversial, but let's talk about Prey. Now to preface this, Prey 2017 is a great game, and a lot of people liked it. It's well made from gameplay to atmosphere, it's all well crafted, but as a reboot specifically to the Prey series, really has nothing connecting it from the original Prey game from 2006, and I think that's a shame for people who really liked Prey 2006. The original game was kind of like a hidden gem with a unique story and a universe that would have been cool to see expanded on, and that is why in August 2006, Prey 2 was announced and was in development all the way up until 2013, and after some development trouble, the project moved over to different developers, eventually ending up at Arcane Studios. It then was decided to cancel Prey 2 and scrap any of the concepts and relations to the original game and just make a different game, which is the Prey that we ended up getting, but with the Prey name slapped onto it. It's really hard to call this a bad game since it's a good game, but as a reboot, it doesn't have anything to do with the original game that could have had any new IP tagged on, and it would have been the same good game. It could have just been its own thing. They call it a reimagining of an IP, but honestly, it's just its own universe with no relation to Prey 2006, which is sad because the game was very good also. Also, while we're at it, does anybody remember the Thief game from 2014? Oh boy. Now, the original Thief series was known for its immersive and open-ended gameplay that emphasized stealth, exploration, and intricate level design. So fans are pretty excited to see a new Thief game in the works, something that would boot up the series once again with a fresh start, but there were a lot of problems with the reboot to this game. It seemed like with the reboot to Thief, there was a larger emphasis put on making a game that's more accessible to a wider audience than the niche that used to really like the older Thief games. So a lot of the mechanics that were iconic for the old Thief games were simplified, kind of removing some of the challenge that was charming in the original Thief titles. Also, the game was much more action-oriented and straightforward than open-ended, allowing for exploration in different ways to approach things, which definitely disappointed fans who were expecting a true spiritual successor to the original Thief games. Tie that together with the fact that the game had a lot of technical problems at launch, including bugs and performance issues, the narrative not being really all that compelling or engaging, and ultimately the anticipation for Thief was just way higher than the actual product that came with the Thief 2014 reboot, and this game to this day is still kind of just a great example of a reboot just not living up to the expectation and fans turning it away. Now, originally I didn't actually realize this, but Homefront might be a great example of another reboot that went horribly awry. The original Homefront game was a first-person shooter developed developed by Chaos Studios and published by THQ. It followed almost this Red Dawn-esque resistance, but this time against a reunified Korea that has invaded the western United States. The game wasn't perfect, but people were pretty open to the game because of the atmosphere and the story. That was 2011. After that, there were a ton of things that happened corporate-wise, with THQ closing down Chaos Studios and eventually THQ having to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. As a part of this bankruptcy, THQ would have to sell its assets and intellectual properties at an auction, and Crytek ended up acquiring the rights to this franchise. So Homefront would actually see its sequel developed by a new studio, Dambuster Studios, published by Deep Silver, but Homefront The Revolution, which came out in 2016, has nothing to do with Homefront, the first game in the series. Instead, Homefront The Revolution went the reboot route, even though there was just one title before it, and takes place in an alternate timeline following a resistance movement against the Army of North Korea occupied in the city of Philadelphia. This time around, the release was not as well received as the first Homefront game, scoring around 4 to 5 out of 10 on average, and ultimately many review outlets pointing out that the game just technically wasn't really up to par. There were a lot of technical issues and flaws along the way that just made the whole game feel like a slog to actually go through, and at the same time the story wasn't anything stand out or worthy of keeping the Homefront name off of the original title. The story wasn't nearly as good, and there was, some rough voice acting and gameplay and gunplay and just a whole lot of glitches. Game Revolution actually stated that the game had monotonous gameplay, inconsistent frame rate, awkward gunplay, forgettable characters, and technical problems, which is a perfect way to sum up why this game just did not do well. Okay, but does anybody remember the Turok series? Turok was a charming Nintendo 64 title and was published by Acclaim, and they went on to release 5 Turok games between 1997 and 2002. But with each title after the second game, things are getting less and less positive reception-wise, and it was starting to become clear that the game was losing its initial edge. The publisher Acclaim wasn't doing too well also, and they would end up filing for bankruptcy, going under in 2004. Interestingly enough, Disney would swoop in and buy the rights to the Turok IP and start working on rebooting the franchise. In 2005, a studio called Propaganda Games would be assigned to the Turok IP, and this was pretty much Turok's last shot at ever being a continuous and relevant franchise after being well known in the late 90s. Well, in 2008, the Turok reboot would arrive, and didn't really do all that well. People didn't really like the reboot because it went for a more gritty and realistic approach that lacked the same charm that maybe the older graphics of the original game had, that was more of these vibrant tropical colors with this impending fog that was really appealing. If anything, it felt like Turok 2008 maybe felt a little bit of a downgrade from that. The gameplay was changed to include more stealth and cover-based combat, which was vastly different from the faster-paced run and gun of the original games. And of course, with this game coming out at the end of the 2000s, online multiplayer was kind of becoming a really big thing. So for a 2008 release, this game would also have to have multiplayer. But compared to other multiplayer FPS games out around this time, like 2008's World at War or Battlefield Bad Company 1, Turok just really couldn't compete. Overall, it just seemed like they had this old IP that was beloved at the end of the 90s, and when they tried to modernize it, it just was so drastic and forceful that fans of the franchise kind of resented it, and at the same time, the game wasn't good enough to pull new fans in and establish itself as something brand new. We can also look at one of the saddest examples here of a reboot gone awry, Unreal Tournament. Now, Unreal Tournament was a massive hit in the early 2000s. All the time we hear about multiplayer games that were big in the late 90s, early 2000s, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Halo, even games like Time Splitters. And Unreal Tournament is kind of amongst some of the greats, but kind of was a game series that was like, if you knew, you knew. Unreal Tournament was awesome. It was just a shame that after so many years, Unreal Tournament's IP started to go dormant and there weren't new releases in the Unreal Tournament franchise. That would be until 2014 when a new project would arise from Epic Games, which would be a brand new approach to game development overall, where Unreal Tournament would release for free as an alpha, and then development would be partially crowdsourced alongside the development internally at Epic Games. This synergy between the community community and the game development studio itself led to a lot of potential for what would be available one day down the road when the game got to a better state. At the beginning, there was a ton of transparency and communication from the development team itself, but in later years, fans started to notice things were slowing down a bit, and apparently in 2017, the team would be moved to go and work on Fortnite as the unexpected explosive popularity of that game required all hands on deck. It wouldn't be until later on in 2018 when fans would hear what they had been fearing this whole time, that the development had ended and the game would just remain at the state that it was in. Now, this game would remain playable in its unfinished alpha state all the way up until earlier in 2023 when the game's servers would be shut down, rendering this game unplayable and Unreal Tournament officially going back into dormant status. Now, there's a ton of other interesting game series that have been rebooted over the years. Some are even more interesting when they're not quite a full reboot, but they kind of are a reboot, or they're branding themselves as a reboot, though they're clearly not. We're looking at Mortal Kombat 1, which is a reboot, but also a sequel to Mortal Kombat 11 and the original Mortal Kombat or something. I'm still confused on this one. But if this video does well enough, we'll definitely do a follow-up video, because there's a lot of series that do this weird half reboot thing, half not reboot thing, and I think that's also something interesting worth talking about. But if you like this, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. If you have a few bucks burning a hole in your pocket, maybe consider becoming a patron. Get your name out there, put your name in the credits right here, and you also support our content creation on interesting topics like this. Otherwise, that's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.